All right. Let me share my screen so we can dive right in then.
Hold on 1 second.
This down. All right. Thanks, Hylos. I appreciate it. I'm very happy to be with you all again. I know I've been here. I think the last couple of times I spoke to y'all, once was on captive wildlife photography and once was on macro. So you're probably wondering, you know, Jeff, why don't you make up your mind and figure out what you'd like to shoot? And you seem to be all over the place, which is true because I do like to shoot just about anything, with one rather large exception, and that's people. So you won't see any of that tonight in my abandoned spaces presentation. But I think one of the things that initially attracted me to photographing abandoned spaces is, in addition to just kind of, you know, getting out and getting into some strange situations, I like it because, you know, mainly I'm shooting things that don't move. That's always a bonus for me. And two, I just love to photograph architectural subjects. So most of the places I like to photograph that are abandoned are really just, you know, architectural studies, but on a building that has seen its better days and a little bit past prime. But it doesn't really matter because a nice architectural detail like maybe this can also be a nice architectural detail in an abandoned building with lots of rust and crust and everything else to it that can make it just as interesting. Now, I don't know why, but for some reason, people are really drawn to, you know, photographs of abandoned places, and including this. I include a couple things in here. This portfolio magazine is as they call it on the cover there, the magazine of lifestyles, interests, and leisure in Naples, Florida. It's kind of a high-end thing for real estate and yachts and stuff like that. And for some reason, they wanted to include a sort of portfolio of mine on abandoned places, and they put my photograph on the cover. And I thought, you know, who am I to argue with them? But it doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense to me that if you're selling high-end real estate, you want to show a bunch of kind of torn up and beat down and decrepit looking buildings. But, you know, whatever, I'm happy to oblige. I did, as Hylos mentioned, I had a really nice exhibit. I really enjoyed the whole experience of doing it at Callenwald, called Shuttered, the Art of Abandoned Spaces. And it was also a surprise to me that they wanted me to do this. They kind of sought me out. I am not someone who markets my photography at all. And so when I did this, I had 32 images hung there in their gallery, and all that I printed them, matted, mounted, everything myself. So it was really a one-person operation. And I was told afterwards that this exhibit sold more photographs than any photography exhibit they've ever had at Callenwald, which shocked me for a number of reasons. Again, why do people want to buy photographs of abandoned spaces? But also it suggested to me that perhaps they didn't sell a lot of photographs at their gallery for other exhibits either, because I say that number and it sounds impressive, but in fact, there were 8 photographs out of the 32 that were sold. I don't know how that stands up against anything else, but to me, it didn't seem like a very remarkable record. But still, it was a great experience for me to kind of, you know, go through that process of putting together an exhibit and sharing it with people, and it was a lot of fun. Now, I did have occasion under the subject of why I photograph these things. They made me write an artist statement, which is something I am not particularly fond of doing. And this is what I came up with. I am particularly drawn to abandoned spaces rich with the remnants of common history and the quiet dignity of decay. These places simultaneously evoke the aspirations of earlier times and the sadness and surrender of loss. Photographing them lends a sense of preservation and permanence to an otherwise fleeting existence, and often offers rare glimpses into places seldom seen by casual observers. Now, that sounds like an artist statement, but the real reason that I like to photograph abandoned places are many. One, the thrill of the hunt. Finding a place is great. Now, we're going to talk here about, you know, maybe what you can do to to find places, but obviously there are places that are available and accessible to people that you don't have to hunt down. And we'll talk about those as well. But it's always fun to find a place and think you've kind of been the first to discover it. There's a real, sense of adventure and even a greater sense of adventure when you venture into some of these places, because Lord knows what you're going to run into. And there is, for me anyway, a real beauty in decay that is different from the sort of traditional architectural photography that I also like to do. And there is a sense of preservation of history, because in a lot of these places that I photograph, you may go back a year later and they're gone entirely. So it's really nice to be able to capture them while you can. And also, in many cases, they make it easier for the photographer to tell a creative story. And as I'll mention a little later in the presentation, I know a lot of people will preach to you that, you should tell a story with your photography. And I think that's good if you can do it, but I think only a limited kinds of photography really lend themselves to storytelling. But what I think your photograph should do is suggest a story. In other words, you don't have to tell the story. You just have to create a photograph that makes a viewer look at it and want to make up their own story, right? That's all that matters, is how a photograph strikes an individual viewer. It doesn't really matter what the photographer thinks, depending on the type of photography you're doing. So rather than tell a story, I always tell people, create a story. Take a photograph that allows a viewer to come up with their own idea of what they're seeing and why. Well, the first thing you have to do, obviously, if you're going to photograph abandoned places, is find them. And there are a number of ways you can do that. One, the simplest way is if you just Google urbex, U-R-B-E-X, or abandoned and your locale. And you'd be surprised sometimes what pops up. You can do Atlanta urbex, you could do Cobb County urbex or abandoned and things like that. And you will likely find things closer to you than you might have imagined. And depending on the descriptions you might come up with, it may tell you the status of those things. I've had many things pop up and that sent me on a wild goose chase, because by the time I got there, the place had already been torn down or something like that. But it's always a good place to start. The other thing you can do is use Google Earth or Wiki Maps and go in and do the aerial satellite views of an area. This will sometimes tell you, for example, if one of those places that you found Googling urbex has already been torn down and is no longer there. But it also can give you a hint as to locations of places you can go and see, like especially in sort of industrial areas in a city or town. You can see things that are worth going and checking out. The other thing you can do is go on photo sites like Flickr, and you can do the same kind of a search, urbex or abandoned, and a location. Photographs will pop up. Some people will tell you where they took their photographs. Others are very sort of religious about not telling anybody where a particular photograph was taken, for fear that someone will either discover their site or the site will become overrun with people, and then it'll get really closed down so that people can't get in and photograph it anymore. But I have found that if you reach out directly, as opposed to putting comments and public comments, but you email the people directly, some are more willing to share with you. So do a search for those things, and some will pop up there. And there are also online forums dedicated really to this, urban exploring, urbex, abandoned, ruins, things like that. So there's a lot of information out there that can get you started. The other thing you can do is you can go on a workshop, and this is something I've done several times. And when I say workshop, it's a bit of an overstatement. What I'm really doing is simply paying for the privilege of going somewhere that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. I'm not really going for the photography instruction. And indeed, I found in a lot of these cases that there really isn't much photography instruction. It really is just giving you access to a place. And I'm going to mention a couple of those as we go further into the program. The other thing you can do is just drive around. And I like to do this in sort of medium town places like Columbus or Macon, Birmingham, places like that. Where you can just kind of wander through drive around the former industrial areas. This photograph of this stairwell, with this wooden stairwell, was in a mill that was being repurposed in Columbus. It was being turned into condos. And there were folks in there working on it. And I just walked in and said, hey, do you mind if I take some pictures before y'all get this completely torn up and cleaned out? And, you know, the people who were there they were just work guys. They could care less as long as I didn't get in their way. So frequently, you know, you can find rehab projects like this going on, and you might be able to get in before they've completely gutted the places. And so I consider that just sort of serendipity. You're driving down a back road, you go in somewhere, and maybe there's somebody there, maybe there's not, and go in and wander around. Now, there are a lot of places you can go that are truly abandoned. But I find that if you're particularly out in rural Georgia, and you come upon a house like this that you would certainly think is abandoned, you know, that you be very careful in approaching them, because there are a lot of old houses that look about in this condition that are still occupied. And even if they're not occupied by the, you know, former owners, there are squatters and other people who live in these places. This one has no windows. All the windows were broken out. And so I kind of approached with care, making sure I didn't see any cars or evidence of people. And that's what I found inside. So I was pretty sure that although people had been in there and used it for various purposes, that no one was actively living in there now. And so I felt pretty safe going in. But in these smaller houses, though, you really do have to be very careful if you wander into one of these places. So those are places that you know are abandoned. Then there are the preserved abandoned places. That's what I call them anyway. And this is from Sloss Furnaces over near Birmingham. And I know some of you are heading over there maybe this weekend. It's a great place to photograph. I was talking to Hylos before we got started and noting that they have cleaned it up a lot, unfortunately, but there's still plenty of good stuff to photograph. It's just, you know, they've got a brand new visitor center there now, and it's, you know, they have gone in and cleaned it up quite a bit. But it's a wonderful place to go in and photograph a building that was semi-abandoned, and then basically it was, you know, it was preserved and turned into this National Historic place. And which is always interesting, because in places like that, you just never know where exactly they're going to start the preservation process. They are not going to fix it up to the way it was, obviously, when it was functioning, but you don't want them to fix it up too much, else it won't have the same appeal that abandoned places do to those of us who really like to photograph abandoned places. Other places like this, though, some of you have been to Eastern Pennsylvania State Penitentiary, a great place to go and photograph in Philadelphia if you're ever up that way. They have a deal where they will, you have to pay an extra little fee. It's like $10 or something, and they will let you use a tripod there, which a lot of places, you know, nowadays don't. And so it's well worth it, I think, if you're one like me who uses a tripod, to take that in there. These are great places to go and photograph, because they are pretty decrepit and decayed and falling apart. But at the same time, you know, they're safe in the sense that, you know, they're staffed, there are people there. It's, you know, open to the public and tourists. And so you don't have to worry about, you know, vagrants and drug addicts and things like that, that you have to worry about in some of these other places. The downside to going to places like that, though, is you go in, and this is, for example, a picture I'm sure you've all seen of the barber's chair at the Eastern State Penitentiary. If you go and do a Google search of, you know, Eastern State Penitentiary barber's chair, you're going to come up with thousands and thousands of images online. So if you go to one of these sort of preserved abandoned places, what you're going to find is you're going to struggle more to take sort of original photographs. And so that's something you have to be mindful of in these places. I always try to find a place like this corridor there that was locked off with a chain link fence across it and everything, because it had not been restored at all or cleaned up, and they didn't want anybody going in there because it was a little dangerous. So I just wedged my camera lens in between the opening in the fence and took the shot. If you're wondering about that cat, there was a colony of cats in the 70s that lived in Eastern Pennsylvania State Penitentiary. And at some point when they decided to start preserving it and protecting it, they had to move the cats out, which they did. And some artists came along later and did an artist installation, and there were these cat statues everywhere. They're just all over the place, taking the place of the original cats. I think they referred to it as the ghost cats. So just a little side note. But again, look for places that are not part of the regular tour and open space, and take advantage of those spaces over what everybody in the general public sees. Then there are places that I call the transitional abandoned. These are the places that were sort of abandoned, semi-abandoned, and now they're being rehabbed. This is Glen Castle. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was the old, I think, Atlanta jail in the 1800s. It was then taken over at some point by the Board of Education. It was served as sort of a book repository and things like that for schools until recently. And when it was purchased and now has been converted to condos, I think, or something like that. This is just this is in East Atlanta. You could see it, I think, from I-20 going into town. And I just happened to be going by there. And of course, there were crews that had been working in there, getting it ready to convert it to lofts or whatever. And I just asked, mind if I take a few pictures? And unfortunately, they had pretty much cleaned the place up. You can see it looks almost broom clean on the floor. The people who buy the units here will never know what's behind the sheetrock and everything that's been installed, but it was a pretty interesting place for the little bit of time I had in there. But really, I got there a little too late because it had already been substantially at least cleaned out, if not cleaned up. But those kind of places you can find in Atlanta now, because there's a lot of old buildings that are being converted. So it's just a matter of wandering around, finding one, and then seeing if somebody will let you in, which wasn't a big deal here. It wasn't a problem at all. And then there's what I call the fake abandon. I don't know if any of you have ever been over to I think it's Jackson Lake, just outside Montgomery. This was the set for the movie Big Fish. And it's on an island in a lake over there, and there's a bridge, and you have to pay to get on it, but it's like $3 or $5 or something like that. And you can go over there and spend the day on the little island photographing what was the set of the movie. So these structures are all kind of neat. They look nice and weathered on the outside. You wouldn't really know it's a movie set till you walked up and looked in the windows and saw there was nothing there. They built the whole house. It's not just a front, but there's nothing at all inside. And in most cases, not even a floor. But it is, on the right day, a great place to go and photograph what looks like sort of an abandoned old town. So just outside Montgomery, not a bad little day trip to go over there if you have other reasons to be in Montgomery. And if you're a wildlife shooter, there is a herd of goats on the island that like to take up residence in these houses. So if you're into shooting goats, that's just a bonus to your visit. And then there's sort of the semi-abandoned places, the places in between, and there are a lot of these in Georgia. A lot of churches. I know a lot of you are familiar probably with the historic churches of rural churches of Georgia, I think it's called. There's a website and a book by the same name that was done by a group that are trying to preserve a lot of these old rural churches. And if you go to their website, you can get detailed instructions and directions on how to get to all these places, some of which are functioning churches, some of which are churches that are in serious need of repair and rehab, and some, sadly, that have collapsed. But they'll give you that information, and that is an ideal resource. There's a great little trip, if you ever want to do a field trip for the club, which I have led several times, called the Historic Churches of East Georgia, and you go out I-20 to Hancock, County, Greene County. And there's about 4 churches out there that you can visit that are all in various stages of near abandonment, and they are open and accessible and easy to photograph. So it's a lot of fun. This isn't one of them. This is one I just came across somewhere along the way near Milledgeville, I think. And you can see the roof. Somebody has taken some old tarps, which were actually giant plastic sheets of billboards, I think from a NASCAR race or something, and thrown them over the top to try to keep the rain from penetrating the roof and further damaging this old church in the hopes of maybe saving it. You know, these kind of places are always a lot of fun. This is one of the churches, and some of you probably visited it out in East Georgia. That's just kind of a neat place to go in and photograph. This is the interior of that one that I showed the outside of a second ago. You'll notice that I think it's really neat. Somebody took all the pews out, and the pews had all been fastened directly into the walls and painted around. So when they took the pews out, it left little outlines of where they were. But you'll notice that the doors were locked to this church, but those 2 windows at the end weren't. And they were very easy. They were open, very easy to get in. And so I did go in, and because I wanted to get a couple shots inside. Because you never know, you could go back in 3 months and this place would be gone. It would have collapsed. The floor is in pretty bad shape. That's why somebody tried to cover it to prevent further water penetration, which is really what kills these structures. But you know, you have to be careful if you're going to be going into one of these places, and you have to particularly be concerned about trespassing, which I will give you a few, I guess, a public service message here. Trespassing is kind of an interesting topic when it comes to photographing abandoned places. You know, almost all abandoned places belong to somebody, even if they're not being used, even if they're, you know, the land belongs to somebody typically. They're rarely completely just abandoned and left for whoever wants to come and take them. You know, they may have been foreclosed on. There may be taxes that were due on them that were never paid, but typically property belongs to somebody. But if they're not posted and they're not fenced in some way that would suggest you can't go there, I generally don't worry about it. I mean, there is a risk to going in these places, and you know, you do have to be mindful of that risk for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute. But my feeling is, if a door is open, I don't mind going in. I am not going to break in a door or a window or anything like that. I do know that breaking and entering is a crime that I am not going to commit. But on trespassing, you know, most of the trespassing signs are put up primarily to shield the owner, if there is one, of the premises from liability. If you go in there and fall and break your leg and then try to sue them for maintaining an unsafe place or attractive nuisance or something like that, they're going to say, look, you had no business being there in the first place, and we put a big old sign there telling you that you shouldn't be trespassing. So if you went in there, you were trespassing, and you were assuming whatever risk that you were going to get injured or hurt or something like that. So, you know, that's mainly why they're put there. I think people are rarely prosecuted for going into abandoned places unless it's been made real clear that they don't want you there. This happens to be at Central State Hospital in Milledgeville, the old mental institute, where I was lucky, I guess, to get to go in and photograph a number of the buildings with permission. And so they had come and unlocked this door and opened it for me. And so I wasn't really trespassing, but I did want to take a picture of the shot and kind of mention this. So don't break into these places. That'll definitely get you in trouble. And don't take any souvenirs, which I've also seen people do, which is not a good thing. So follow the rule that you do in the national parks. Take only photographs, leave only footprints. Don't do any damage to the property or anything like that, or you will risk spending the night in a local jail somewhere if you're not careful. This is a building, an old factory up in Rome. It's very close to the Braves minor league stadium up there. And this was an interesting place that you can see this fence out here is not a fence that encloses the building itself. You can drive right in there and drive in that driveway, which I did with a couple of other explorers. And you can see an exterior staircase here that takes up to a doorway here. A wonderful doorway that tells you danger, do not open, but it says that on the inside, not on the outside. So, you know, how would you know? And you can see the vines and things that have grown inside into the door. Well, we opened the door and went in and wandered around and spent about 2 hours in there taking photographs. This was a particularly difficult place though to photograph because it was pitch black inside. Most of the windows have been boarded up, so there's very little light coming in. And it was very difficult to photograph, but it is just another place that's not very far away. I don't know, it was probably 5 years ago when I went in there. I don't know if it's still accessible or not. But when you go in these places, I can't caution you enough, look out for, they are full of environmental hazards. Asbestos all over the place, lead paint, mold, and animal feces are probably the 4 top things that you're likely to encounter in some of these really old and neglected structures. This photograph, well, actually, I think this is one of the old wooden staircases at Lindale Mill. But this photograph was another one from Central State Hospital. And this was actually one of the cleaner buildings. But when I got there and met the guy who was going to let me in, he was the guy who was in charge of their environmental unit, if you will. And he started pulling out a hazmat suit that he was going to suggest I wear. And that gave me my first clue, I guess, that, you know, this was not a good place to be in. I didn't wear it, though, because I just didn't think it was necessary. I wasn't going to get in there and be crawling around and getting all into stuff or stirring things up. And but if it was any clue as to the dangers in there, he didn't go in. He just opened the door and stayed outside. But there are a lot of rotted boards, ceilings. There's a lot of critters in these places, snakes, bats, you know, all kinds of things that are dangerous if they bite you, rabies and you know, animals, rabid animals. There's raccoons and foxes and other things that get in and live in these things because they're protected mostly from the elements. So you run into a lot of that stuff. And on rare occasion, you can run into humans. And I've had that happen a couple of times. It scared me nearly to death. In most cases, they seem to be about as scared of encountering me as I was encountering them. But I could see situations where that would not be the case. So I'm always on the lookout to make sure nobody's in these places. This is an old industrial site up in Chattanooga. And this beam of light was coming through the hole in the ceiling. And a friend of mine who was photographing with me, I was taking this picture and he walked up and scooped up a big old handful of whatever was on the floor. I'm sure he thought it was sand and threw it up in the air so it would make it easier to see the sunlight and the sunbeam coming into the building. Needless to say, I took my picture and got the heck out of there in a hurry because I have no idea what that was. There could have been any, you know, rust and asbestos and all sorts of stuff that he had just managed to throw up in the air so we would all get a good, you know, breath of it and fill our lungs. So don't do things like that. This is bad. A few safety tips: do not go alone. I can't emphasize this enough. I have gone alone into some smaller places. I don't think I'd do it anymore. Even if you do or don't, make sure somebody who's not with you knows where you're going in case something happens and they need to send somebody out to try and find you. Be sure you have flashlights of some kind. I recommend a headlamp. I think it works better. And you don't have to use your hands to carry it. Wear appropriate clothes. Even if it's the middle of summer, it's hot as can be. You're going to wear long jeans, boots of some kind with thick soles that, you know, nails aren't going to go through, and long sleeve shirts of some kind to protect your arms, because you will inevitably rub up against something, and it's just best to protect your skin as much as possible. Now that we've all gotten used to wearing masks, it's probably a good idea to wear one of those too if you have one. That's another thing I'm not real good about doing on these things, just because I have difficulty breathing through them. But it makes a big difference. And if you're at all sensitive to things like mold and stuff like that, you really ought to wear one. And make sure your tetanus shots are up to date for reasons I'll get into in a minute. Always a good idea, because you're going to encounter a lot of rusty and things with nails in them and stuff like that. So be sure you're prepared for your trip. This was a corridor in that factory in Rome I was telling you about that was very, very dark. I was walking down the corridor, tripod over my shoulder, camera hooked into the tripod, ready to go. I had my headlight on and it was shined down the hall. Well, what I didn't see was this big rectangular dark space in the dead center of the hallway, which just happened to be a 4-foot pit full of really nasty water and all sorts of things. I was just walking down there, and for some reason I was distracted. And I did one of those, Wile E. Coyote step off the cliff, and there's that 1 second before you fall, when you're about to fall. And I just went right into this thing. Now I didn't, I'm doing what every photographer does when they fall, which is holding my camera and tripod up, trying to make sure I don't crash and have it get, broken or my lens shattered or something like that. Never mind my health. I had 2 people with me. They were up on another floor. And so I was kind of just yelling, "Hey guys, come down here. I fell in a hole." And I couldn't get out because it was 4 feet deep, full of water, and there was broken glass all around the top lip of it. And so to pull myself up, I had to put my hands in this broken glass, and that didn't seem like a good thing. But because they are true friends, they didn't hear me and didn't come. So I eventually did have to crawl out of this hole, and I just kept looking back into this black pit of black water, thinking how many years of what is in there and what have I done to myself, and I'm soaking wet. And it really tells you, and I'm a careful person, just how easy it is, just if you lose your concentration for just a minute, what can happen to you in these places. And if even if I'd been alone, I would have probably gotten out. I did go to the doctor a couple of days later because my leg was really hurt, and I thought maybe I'd fractured my leg or something. And they did x-rays and said no. And I said, well, what about all the stuff I was in? I mean, should I be concerned about getting anything? And the doctor just looked at me and goes, your skin's a very resilient organ. You'll be fine. So he didn't seem at all concerned about it. But there are lots of bad things that can happen to you in these places. All throughout this building, there were holes like this. But the thing is, about half of them went all the way down to the floor below, and in some cases 2 floors below, because they were where pulleys went up and down between floors and things like that, and conveyor belts and stuff like that. So I was fortunate that I fell into one that had a bottom, I guess. Well, all that to say, you shouldn't take unnecessary risk. And unnecessary is sort of in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, some of us will take risk more than others. Some of us will assess risks differently. This, of course, is Lindale Mill. Those of you who've been there, I wanted to get a centered shot of that long, deep bay there. And the only way I could get that was through a broken window, kind of standing up on this plastic, I don't know if that's a water tank or it held some sort of liquid. And I've got my tripod wedged up there, and I'm all taking my picture, and some woman walked by because we were up there with a group. And she says, "I don't believe I'd do that." And I said, "You know what? That's really smart, because if you don't think you should do it, you shouldn't." And so I always tell people, if it gives you any, the heebie-jeebies at all, even though this wasn't anything I viewed as particularly dangerous, don't do it when you're in these places. This is another place outside of Athens in Maxey's, Georgia, a town with a very fascinating history. It's said to be an old hat factory there. It was a little storefront where it was a sort of a general store in the bottom and a hat factory on the second floor. It's been through several attempts to rehab it and renovate it, and was sort of in the middle of that when I got there and walked in. And I just loved this staircase. I mean, this wrought iron staircase was amazing. But I also wanted to see what was upstairs. And when I kind of looked at the staircase, it's like, well, there are those 4 kind of crooked, support poles holding it up. So I figured that's probably okay. And I went ahead and went upstairs. There wasn't much to see, but it's another one of those things where you have to ask yourself, is it really worth the risk of going up there and having that staircase potentially collapse on you? I think this place has been sealed off now. I don't think you can get in there anymore. I don't know if they're still working on it. It's been a few years since I've been up there. If any of you have been there, right on Main Street, or what passes for Main Street in Maxey's, Georgia. Equipment is very simple, and it's very much similar to what you would take to any kind of a architectural photography shoot. Basically a tripod and a cable release. You're almost always going to need a tripod. I know some of you don't like to use tripods. I know that some of you think with the new high ISO cameras and image stabilization and all that, you don't need one. But truth is, when you're going into abandoned places, they can be pretty dark, and you're going to be doing long exposures. And to do that, you're going to want to have your tripod. I usually take a couple of lenses, a good wide angle lens for the kind of open shots, and then a macro lens, which doubles both as a macro, which is good to use in these kind of places, but also just as a longer focal length lens, so that I can get some detail shots that aren't even necessarily macro images. I always use a polarizer. I probably said this before when I've talked to you all. Every lens I have that I use with any regularity has a polarizer permanently attached to the end of it. And that's because I use polarizers more often than I don't. And it's easier to take one off if I'm in a situation where I don't want to use it, and to fish one out and put it on when I am going to use it, because I'm almost always using it. I don't use skylight filters, and I don't use UV filters and things like that. I use neutral density filters once in a while, but not typically for this kind of photography. But I always use polarizers because they are so great for knocking reflections off and glare off and things like that. So for those of you nature photographers, or just use them for, darken your skies and things like that, they are in fact great for just about any kind of photography you can think of. And I use them for everything. And of course, spare batteries, you can need that because you're going to be taking long exposures, and you're going to be running down your battery quite a bit. So it's always good to have those on hand. And as I said, a flash or a flashlight is critical. I mean, you have to have a flash or flashlight. It's one, good, to help you get around in some of these buildings, and two, it's good to do light painting and things like that. So if you're in a pretty dark room, you want to highlight a piece of equipment or some feature in the room, you can do a little quick light painting, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. The other thing is, whenever I shoot an abandoned place, I always put it in context. I always try to take a picture of what it is I'm photographing from the outside, even if it isn't very attractive. This is an old hotel, and I can't even remember where it's in Alabama. I want to say it's over near Birmingham, but I could be wrong about that. I've forgotten the name of it. I'll have to go back and look. But an old little hotel on the side of the road, not much else around it, an old wooden structure. You can see it's in pretty bad shape, but the door's wide open, no signs, no nothing. So I figured it was fair game to go in and wander around. It's another one of these places, and I see this so often in these kind of places, that you go in and they're just interesting studies. And here I do a lot of black and white when I'm using when I have windows, particularly with strong light coming in windows. Just think it seems to be more effective in black and white. But somebody had gone in and done some initial cleanup in the place, as if they were going to rehab it. And you see this all the time. And then once they get into it, realize, it's a money pit. It's going to cost them too much money. It's never going to be worthwhile. It's a lot more work than they ever anticipated. And then they abandon it again. So it's twice abandoned, I guess. But these are the kind of places that you can find all around. When I approach an abandoned space, I kind of have the same strategy all the time. This was actually photographed at the old Atlanta sprocket factory, which has been converted to a recycling center. I think it still is anyway. And so they had fixed up most of it. And but there were whole areas where they hadn't done anything. This was the old shower room, basically, for the workers who used to work in the factory, which is kind of, you can see, an interesting setup in and of itself. But when I go into a place like this, the first thing I do is, if I'm with other people, if they all go right, I go left. I never want to be following or part of a gaggle of photographers. One, because I don't like to do that. But two, I don't like to be influenced by what everybody else is photographing if I can help it. Nothing kind of is worse for me than if you go on some kind of a workshop and you've got 15 people lined up, all in a row taking the same exact picture and things like that. So I always kind of like to go off on my own. That runs a little counter to my earlier advice about be sure someone goes with you, but I'm not going out of, shouting distance or anything like that, but I'm not going to go with the crew if I can help it. And if I can't help it, I tend to either try to get ahead of the group or lag back and be the last in the group. I tend to go and explore and go as far as I can in a place and then work my way back, because then I've seen what's ahead of me and what's available and sort of started getting an idea of what I want to photograph. And I also, know that by going to the furthest point, most people are stopping along the way to take pictures, and I've already gone to the other end. And then I find myself back at the beginning. And so I'm not going to run out of time before I've had an opportunity to really see everything and know what's there. So I always try to do that. I also, in different areas, I start wide. I want to capture the scene like this, and then I might start working in onto the details and trying to capture discrete details that I think are interesting or different. And all the time, of course, you're looking for unique subjects and perspectives, especially if you're in a place that other people have been in and photographed before. It's always good to photograph it in a little different way. Two examples of that where I've gone into the group, and I mentioned, you can do workshops and things like that. One is, this is the Klotz Throwing Company. It was the last operating silk mill in America. It's in Western Maryland. And perhaps somebody of you has been there. There was an old guy who bought the place, and he was trying to save it for its historical significance. And the place was just becoming more and more difficult to save. And he was in his 80s, and he died recently, last couple of years. And so the fear is that the place will now finally collapse. But it's an interesting place because it was an operating silk mill that a union came in, and the workers went on strike or something, and the company closed the doors and never reopened it, and didn't take anything out of it. All the machinery was still there, and it was closed in the 50s. So it sat there. I photographed it probably 5 years ago, for 65 years, basically unused. But the ceiling was caving in and things like that. But even in places like that, I kind of want to go in and get the bigger scene and then sort of work my way into the story. There's one bobbin of silk there left out on that floor. And so I kind of wanted to get that in the context of the larger mill out of focus, and try to work in on the details a little bit so that you can go through and show what has happened to this place. And you can get a sense of not only what its function was, but what's happened to it in the intervening time. And it was just a fascinating place. You can see these old round bottom fire buckets that when there was a fire, the fire brigade would grab the buckets full of water and put the fire out. And no one is really 100% sure, I don't think, why the bottoms were round. One theory was so that no one would steal the buckets, because they'd be largely useless because you couldn't set them down because they won't stand up. So they had no use beyond the fire use here at the factory. Others said that there's something about the physics, basically, of that round bottom that makes it do something when you actually throw the water, that makes the throw better, I guess. The water swirls around and goes out further or something like that. There are any number of theories. The other being that hanging up, nobody's going to trip on them or anything like that, but they always had to be readily accessible in case of a fire. But that's the kind of image that you can look at and say, you start thinking about what's the story behind this? Why are those fire buckets round on the bottom? It's interesting. And of course, there's all sorts of details in places like this that you can photograph that are interesting. I try to find elements like this, a calendar from February of 1949, because that sort of dates probably when the last time it was used, or within a matter of a couple of years of when it was last used. And that's also kind of a good thing to have when you're going back and trying to, talk about this particular place. But like I said, a fascinating place. These are the little tags that went on the row of bobbins that showed what kind of silk was being made at that particular time and things like that. The other thing was that you had these cubby holes where all the workers would leave their shoes and things, and they'd put on work shoes. And this whole rack had just tons of things left in it because the workers all assumed they'd be coming back the next day, and that the union would prevail and the owners would give in. But the owners didn't, so they never were able to get back in and even claim their possessions and things like that. So another, opportunity to tell a story. And the other place that I was at this summer is Silo City up in Buffalo, New York. Mark Mayo, an Atlanta photographer, runs this, or used to run this workshop up there every summer, I think, for 15 years or so. And I'd been wanting to go and just never could get it on my calendar. And I went this summer because it's the last time he was doing it, because unfortunately Silo City has also gone condo. And I know you can look at this and say, no way. But yes, they are in fact going into a lot of the buildings. The factories around these silos are going condo, and the factory, the silos themselves are being used for art exhibits and all sorts of unusual purposes. So anyway, Silo City had been sold and is no longer accessible, but a wonderful opportunity to go into a place and just see how things worked. These were the conveyor belts. The ships would pull up, they'd unload grain. It would come off the ships on these conveyor belts and be dumped into these huge 20-story silos and things like that. Just kind of a fascinating place. And then at the bottom of all these silos, you'd have these funnels where the grain would be poured out and as it was loaded back out to be shipped out to factories and things like that. So a place you could spend, I mean, the place was huge, and we were there for 2.5 days, I think. Just a wonderful opportunity to get out and get into a place that really has a history, but also was a bit of a mess. And I really encourage, if you have an opportunity to do one of these kind of workshops at a place like this. There are a couple of photographers who run these kinds of workshops all the time. The guy who did the silk mill, for instance, up in Pennsylvania, has a website, and he does 3 or 4 different types of these abandoned places workshops every year. So they're a lot of fun if you like to shoot this kind of a thing. That was one of the big snow shovel looking things that the guys used to shovel the grain at the bottom of the silos with. So little artifacts and details like that are things that are always fun to photograph. Things like this, detail shots and things. But again, I start wide, and then I kind of start focusing on what I think are interesting details to photograph. And a photograph like this doesn't really matter where I took it, right? I mean, there's nothing that says Silo City about this photograph, but that's true of, I guess, a lot of what we do in these places. The one thing that's really important, though, no matter what you do, is if you see something that interests you, you need to preserve the shot. I showed this picture earlier from Eastern Pennsylvania State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. This was Al Capone's cell. That's where he was spent his time when he had been incarcerated. And you can see it was not your typical prison cell, even though the walls and everything certainly were. But he did have the ability to bring in some kind of nice furnishings. Well, this was probably 10 years ago when I took this picture, and I went back 3 years ago, I would say, and it now looks like this, which to me was very disappointing. That's not how I want my abandoned Al Capone cell to look, but that's what it looks like now, complete with fresh flowers, by the way. So you can see this is the dilemma that any of these places that are trying to preserve these old places in a state of decay faces, right? How far do you go to preserve it, and how far do you go instead just to maintain it so that it doesn't get worse? I like the places that just keep them from getting worse, that kind of freeze them in place. I don't want them to fix them up too much. They're not fun to photograph anymore. Composing, and just a couple of things on this real quick. With abandoned places, it's just like composing any other shot, right? You're looking for sort of a way to position things in a frame. You don't want to center things. Here are the three sinks. You're always being told photograph things in three. There's interest in you kind of bounce off between the window and the sinks. You don't know what's going on around the corner there. That gives you something to think about. That's the kind of thing I like to shoot, that you look at and you just kind of say, wow, that's what was that used for back in the day. This was a part of the administrative office in the Atlanta sprocket factory I mentioned. I just thought it was kind of a good rule of thirds, chair right where it needs to be. But I loved all these squares. I mean, the square ceiling tiles, the square in the windows, the squares on the floor, the loose squares just hanging out there and everything like that. Kind of just a classic, simple composition, which is what I really try to do, even with abandoned places, is distill them down to some simple idea and elements. You should always ask yourself, because it's easy to get overwhelmed by what you're seeing sometimes in these places. What is it you're trying to photograph? What is your subject? What are you trying to capture other than just this general scene of rust and decay? I differentiate between what I call complex compositions and busy ones. Busy ones don't really have any focal point or subject, but you can have a complex image that still does. This is an example, I guess, of an image that could go either way, but what I liked about it is the curve of this pipe, the shadow that matched the curve of the pipe, the paint on the brick that matched the curve of the pipe, the way it went around the round hatch here and things like that, this little half circle toward the bottom left that kind of held that corner in, even the line of the timber at the top going off into the upper right corner. Everything seemed to fit into place. And even though it's complex and busy and there's a lot there, I think the composition works. The key is really just isolating the details that you want in your image. And that's true of all photography, right? We always say photography is about exclusion. It's about removing things to get your image as simple as possible. And you just bore down on the essential elements of your composition. And part of that means you just have to take your time. And that's where, if you're on a tripod, it helps you because it slows you down and makes you think more carefully about what it is you're photographing. You also need to, in these places, really work your subject. This was up at Lindale Mill, I think, actually. And I really like, somebody had thrown this umbrella down there. I like the exit sign. I like that the handrails all, kind of leading lines down. I like the brighter umbrella itself attracted your attention. I like sort of the tension between the umbrella and the exit sign, but it could easily be, just a close-up, more of a detailed shot of the umbrella, or, a compromise of the two, a little tighter shot. But the point is, and most of us, I think we do this, we recognize this, it's often not the first picture you take that's the one you really like in the end. It's after you spend a little time looking at an image and working it from different sides and different vantage points that really makes it more interesting. Same is true of what I call making choices. And one of the first choices you have to make when you're photographing in any place, right, is between a vertical and a horizontal image. This is Lindale Mill. I like the windows. I like the leading line of the pipes that take you back to whatever that little fan device looking thing is. I don't know what it is. But it pulls you back into the image, right? But it's a very different image and has a very different feel if you go vertical with this and take the windows out, right? It strengthens in some ways the leading lines in the roof and the ceiling and on that right wall, right pillars. it pulls you more deeply into the composition because you're not being pulled out by all those lit windows in the foreground. You just have those windows in the background. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other. It's just a very different look made of the same subject just by flipping your camera 90 degrees. And the other nice thing is that, you know, if you're just into abstracts and things like that, there's a lot of possibilities in abandoned places, right? Just the color and texture and things like that you can isolate and use. I've even gone in some places. You can imagine if you're somebody who likes to work with texture overlays on images and things like that, if you take a close up of a piece of that cracked greenish blue paint in the bottom of this image, it makes a wonderful texture. So you can just go out and collect textures in these places that you can use in other photographs. The colors are great. Sometimes you find just wonderful lines and things like that. So it's not always just about capturing the literal image of what you're seeing, but also sometimes these abstracts can be a lot of fun. Probably the biggest thing you have to worry about in photographing abandoned places is difficult lighting, typically because there's no lighting in the buildings. They tend to be very dark. And if you're there in the middle of the day, the windows tend to be very bright. And so you're constantly having to deal with that strong contrast. And as I mentioned earlier, you're frequently working in very, very low light. This room was, I mean, almost practically pitch black, just a little bit of light coming in through a crack in the ceiling. So it's a very long exposure, again, which is something you're going to be doing a lot if you're in a place that doesn't have a lot of windows, or as is often the case, if the windows are boarded up. And so no lights or not much light is getting in. Those are some of the worst places to photograph when there's just no light. But you will be doing long exposures, and so you got to be prepared for that. You're also going to run into these real strong contrasts, as I mentioned, between bright light coming in the window and a dark interior. And the only way you can capture these reliably at all is if you're shooting multi-exposure, either blending exposures or doing HDR shots, which I tend to do a lot if it's in an environment like this. It's just something that, you know, you need to have in your toolkit. And for those of you who don't do HDR and that sort of stuff, it's gotten, you know, much easier to do now. Lightroom and certainly Photoshop and all of them allows you to do this without any special software or anything like that. So it's something that you're going to want to have in your toolkit if you're shooting abandoned places. A couple of quick tips there. Some people go crazy on HDR and take like 8 frames or something like that. Really, all you're trying to do is take enough images that will capture your darkest, you know, shadow and your brightest detail. And, you know, the typical HDR formula, you know, is you shoot dead on exposure and then 2 stops above and 2 stops under, and then combine the 3 images. But in a lot of these places, you'll find yourself maybe shooting the dead on exposure that your meter tells you, and then 2 stops under, and then 2 stops under that. You don't need to go the 2 stops above because, you know, you've got all the highlights you want or something like that. So you just shoot the minimum number that you need, and you'll be better off. And that's really easy to do. And sometimes you just have to recognize the contrast is so great, you're not going to get anything because the window's too bright. And, you know, you got 15 stops difference between the darkest in the room and the bright light coming in the window. And it's just not even worth worrying about. You want to always be able to see detail in the windows. And you don't want to end up having those awful gray patches you get when you try to recover highlights after the fact when they're completely blown out. So definitely don't do that. And don't overcook them. I mean, you know, HDR in its early days, it was kind of trendy as people were experimenting, and it made everything look cartoonish. Now it's, you know, I find it's always best if you're doing an HDR shot and you process it, you know, walk away from it for a while when you think you're through with it, and then come back and look at it again. You may find yourself pulling back some of those dials a little bit so that it doesn't look so HDR-ish. And one way you can do that which I do a lot, is I shoot a lot of HDR in black and white, where you can get the contrast. This is an example really of an extreme contrast, the light coming in the window and the dark inside. But it doesn't look overly HDR'd in black and white, because the color is usually what is the dead giveaway when you've kind of overcooked your HDR. The color is oversaturated and things like that. But in black and white, that problem disappears. And as I said at the very beginning, suggest a story. You don't have to tell a story, although you can try and do that. The main thing you want to do is you want people to look at an image and kind of think about a minute, try and work their way through it. Where is this? What is this? What are all these weird colors? Why is that wheelchair sitting there in the middle of the hall? What was this place? Certainly it's abandoned at this point, or not used anyway, but what was it used for? Is it a hospital, or a nursing home, or what was it? But let the images suggest their own story. This one, to me, was a particularly poignant image when I took it under very difficult conditions. This was one of the buildings at Central State Hospital. And this was basically the medicine chest in one of the wards. And you can see people all hung their toothbrushes in this common cabinet. And they had little labels with their name above theirs. And so it was just filled with all these nails. And here, this building hadn't been occupied for 50 years when I took this picture, and there were still toothbrushes there that really make you wonder, one, about, hygiene. I think it was a little different in those days, obviously, when you could put 50 toothbrushes in one cabinet all together like that. Probably not a smart thing. But there's a certain poignancy to that, and knowing that those were used by people who were kept there and frequently against their will, committed to this mental hospital, and what the conditions in life there must have been like. But again, you can sort of make your own story up. This is a photograph from the semi-abandoned, trying to be preserved hospital on Ellis Island, and which is a really neat place that you can also, there's a workshop, several workshops people run out there that you can photograph there. It's just a fantastic place, but you can imagine these people who come over on these ships who didn't sort of pass the physical test when they came to America, and had to be in Ellis Island sent over to the hospital as opposed to being released into the country. And these people, the picture on the right, one of the bathrooms where, every morning, I guess they get up and look in the mirror and they see the Statue of Liberty out the window, and how emotional and difficult that must have been to feel like you were so close and yet so far. And so I love finding places like this to photograph and really try to find compositions that suggest a story, that make people think and look at it and stay in your photograph longer than the 2 seconds it takes most people just to look and go, that's nice, move on. The whole goal is to make people want to stop and think about what they're seeing. But above all else, my recommendation is, have fun in these places and be careful and don't go crazy. But there's also a lot of fun things to photograph. I don't know why bathrooms fascinate me, but I've spent more time than I care to admit in them, in these old buildings, taking pictures and things like that. Well, I've got on my website, which is just a SmugMug site, nothing fancy. That's the address, milsteen.smugmug.com. I've got a whole gallery of abandoned places with different folders with different places, some near here, some farther away. If you go wander through that and see a place you're interested in or whatever, feel free to email me. I'm happy to share any information I have about any of them, about where they were, or if they're accessible, not accessible, things like that. So, well, I think that's it. If there are any questions, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask questions. Unfortunately, when I shared my screen, I lost the chat. So if anybody put questions there, I don't know. But I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and hopefully somebody's still out there.
Yeah, Jeff, I have one. Have you
Sure.
been able to do the Atlanta prison farm?
I have been there. Are you all? You're not seeing. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I had to get back to back to where I was. I have been there. You know, that place has been through a lot of difficulties because it's burned down a couple times. They've started getting stricter about not letting people access it because they're supposed to be converting it, and the city is supposed to be repurposing that property now. And you know, it also happens to be very near, I believe, still a state patrol post there
That is
that
true.
probably a little more iffy to get in there.
Yeah.
The Atlanta Police Department practices target practice out there as well. So be super careful. And there's places you fall through through the ground. It looks like dirt, and next thing you know, you're 16 foot down.
Yeah, I never thought though that there was that much, you know, to photograph there. It was basically a cinder block structure for the most part, and there was some graffiti and stuff. But I really, you know, my favorite thing are sort of the factories and things like that because you can get a sense of what was done there and you know, kind of see how a building worked. And those buildings tend to be designed around a specific function, which was also kind of interesting and different. But yeah, there's